Today's lecture is supported by the Donald West King and Frances Lila King Lectureship. Donald Jr. has hardly missed a summer at Chautauqua since he first began working on the grounds in 1940. He established this endowment to honor his parents. We thank the King family for their support, as we thank all of you who give to the Chautauqua Fund. Sarah Ladislaw is Director and Senior Fellow of the Energy and National Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. As the director of this program, Ms. Ladislaw leads CSIS's work in energy policy, market, and technology analysis. She has published numerous works on U.S. energy policy, global and regional climate policy, and clean energy technology. Prior to joining CSIS, Ms. Ladislaw worked in the Office of the Americas in the Department of Energy's Office of Policy and International Affairs. She's also spent a short period of time working with Statoil as their Senior Director for International Affairs in the Washington office. Ms. Ladislaw is a member of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's Strategic Analysis Technical Review Panel, the Strategic Advisory Council for Georgia Tech's Strategic Energy Initiative, and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She also teaches a graduate-level course at the George Washington University, where she received both her bachelor's and her master's degrees. She is joined on her first visit to Chautauqua by her husband, Greg, and their two sons, Evan and Brendan. Her lecture this morning is titled Energy and Geopolitics, How the Tables Have Turned. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Ladislaw to the Chautauqua stage.
Good morning. It is a real pleasure to be here today. I'm a first-time Chautauquan, long-time energy wonk. So I'm just learning this week with my family about what a special place this is. And I want to say thank you to Matt and to Shara and to other folks who made this possible for me and my colleagues to spend time with you here today. As Matt said, I'm going to talk to you today about energy and geopolitics. Just to get a sense of who's in the room, how many of you have worked in the energy industry? That's great. Okay, so we've got some other energy folks here too. How many of you spend a lot of time thinking about energy, whether locally or globally? Excellent. That's great. That's great. So in my experience doing talks like this and wherever I go in the world, folks, when I say energy and geopolitics, something pops into your head. And it may be oil and gas, it may be OPEC, Saudi Arabia, it may be nuclear energy issues, it may be natural gas issues, and it might be climate change and renewable energy. I am probably not going to be able to cover every single one of those things in depth today. But what I'm going to do is try to share with you some of what we spend our time doing at CSIS in the energy program to try and point out in a very bipartisan, very helpful way what we think is really important and changing in the energy landscape, and what we think policymakers should do about that, what we think companies should do about that, and what we think civil society and people like all of you should do and think about some of these issues. My hope is to talk to you a little bit about some interesting things today, to give you a better appreciation for some of the things that we're grappling with, but ultimately to leave you feeling empowered. A huge number of you raised your hand when I asked if you think about energy issues on a regular basis, and I love that. That's probably one of the favorite parts of my job, is meeting with interested and engaged stakeholders in the energy landscape. And quite frankly, and hopefully I'll end on this message, I think that that's one of the most important parts of the energy landscape today, is that you, as a consumer of energy, as an interested stakeholder in the energy world, can actually affect more change today than ever before. And so I want you to feel empowered by that. And I find what I do on a day-to-day basis a really uplifting and interesting way to spend my time. But as we all learned in kindergarten, there's no I in team. This is my team. I work with some of the best people that a person could hope to work for. People who've worked in the energy industry for 30 years or so, folks that worked in the intelligence community, folks that have led agencies within government, thinking about energy policy issues, and then a lot of folks who actually make all of this work possible. For any of you who are interested, we spend our year putting anywhere between 50 to 80 events online for the public. When people ask me, what do you do, Sarah? I say, well, I advise policymakers, I advise companies, I advise people who are thinking about where to make investments in the energy sector from a public policy standpoint. I think the most important part of what we do, and frankly what CSIS does, is make that available to the general public. We take that work very, very seriously, and these are the people that help me do that. I want to dispel a few myths first. So one of the myths is, it's not really a myth, but we'll just call it that, is that when CSIS came here, you're told that we're these policy people, right? And we spend our time doing, big, important things like testifying before Congress and running high-level panel discussions. That's the head of OPEC, and that's the CEO of Hess Oil Corporation. These are the kinds of things we sort of do on a day-to-day basis. We put out big studies about important strategic issues going on in the energy landscape. But just to get to know me a little bit better, I am really just a small-town girl from New Hampshire who liked to sit on a lake and think about really important global issues. That's my lake. It's Lake Umbagog. Anyone ever heard of it? Northern New Hampshire? Yay! Great. So that's where I would spend my summers and where I really got the bug for international affairs. I really got the bug for thinking about issues that affect the broader landscape for all of humanity, for public policy issues, economic issues, security issues. And so that's why I just wanted to say, I've only been here for 4 days, but I deeply admire what all of you are doing. Sitting by a lake, dedicating yourself to thinking about the world and the world around you. I think if more people did that, it would be a really excellent thing. So I applaud you for that. I'd also say it's what led me to CSIS, where we do a lot of that as well. We spend time, my colleagues that you've met earlier this week, talking about some of these really big, important issues and trying to think about ways in which we can affect or change them for the better. So the second myth I'd like to dispel is I introduced myself as an energy wonk. I'm not born an energy wonk. I'm not an engineer by training. I work with a lot of engineers. I'm not a scientist by training. So I sort of stumbled into this career. And I began a little bit like John Alterman and Scott Kennedy, my colleagues that you met earlier this week. I was a Japanese language major. I studied East Asian cultures and politics and economics, and I really liked doing that. But I didn't want to be stuck in one region of the world. I liked trying to figure out what was going on in between regions of the world. So I became like Kath Hicks. I went to school for international security. And I quickly figured out that I didn't really have an affinity for the guns, bombs, ships, germs version of the world. I'm really glad Kath does, because she's great at what she does. And it's a really important work, but it really wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. It wasn't the right lens for me. You're going to meet Denise tomorrow. And let me just say, when I started my career, cybersecurity wasn't nearly as evolved an issue as it is right now. And it's also pretty terrifying. So I don't spend all of my time in cybersecurity, but I'm really glad that Denise does. What I did was I chose a lens, energy, that allowed me to travel the world in a way that I find deeply gratifying and always interesting. So I get to think about geopolitics. That's Henry Kissinger, first Arab oil embargo, thinking about large geopolitical issues, how energy makes countries relate to one another. I get to think about systems, technical systems, how the energy that you use every day gets to your home, how that's changing, what are the complications and the new innovations that have something to do with that. That's a schematic of a smart grid. You might not be able to see it. But it's basically the idea that a power generation unit might not always be sending you energy. You might be sending it energy. You might be sending the energy from your house around to your local community. I get to think about the world, and particularly this globe is planetary health. Thinking about climate change and the health and the impact of energy resources, development and use on the world in which we live. I get to think about development. 1.2 billion people without access to modern electricity services. And if you count the people who get beyond that basic threshold of just having a light bulb in their home, billions more that don't have the kind of energy services that we have and are desperately going to need them in order to continue to develop. I get to think about commerce and business, big mergers, big deals, big dollar signs, and increasingly, small mergers, small deals, small startups. It's a really exciting time to be thinking about the way in which people are trying to make money and affect the energy industry. I get to think about innovation. I mentioned the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We've got one of the best laboratory systems in the world here in the United States, and we've got an active private sector thinking about how to innovate, how to create new technologies, and we get to work with them. I get to think about policy and regulatory processes. For those of you who are interested in the U.S. energy landscape and U.S. energy policy, that's what my masterclass is going to be on this afternoon. Can't possibly cover all of it here today and talk about any other country. So if you are interested in doing a deep dive in U.S. energy policy, please sign up for that course, and I'm happy to talk about it later this afternoon. I will talk about the U.S. within the context of this talk as well. And then finally, I get to talk about security. So I get to visit the guns, bombs, ships, and insecurity side of the world, think about how energy affects security dynamics. For any of you who are thinking about starting a career or have folks in your life, grandparents, children, nephews, who are looking for a lens that allows them to satisfy huge amounts of curiosity across a wide range of issues and to affect things that are deeply strategically important for just about every country across the globe, I'd recommend energy. It's been a really good career path for me. The last myth that I want to dispel before getting into the meat of the presentation this morning is one about energy. People often ask me, is there one limitless source of energy in the world that we can tap and we know how to harness and we know how to use? And usually the answer to that question is no, not necessarily, or it has a lot of caveats to it. And I would say for any of you who have seen me and my two boys and my husband walking around campus, we have tapped that or found that limitless source of energy in a 5- and a 7-year-old boy. We don't know if we can harness it for good or for evil, but we're trying really hard. So if you see my children climbing something or breaking something or eating lots of things, you'll know that that's that limitless source of energy I talked about this morning. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to spend time talking about 3 key trends. They're not complete, they're not everything that we think about, but there's certainly some things that we're spending a lot of time, talking to people about around the world. They sit at the intersection of commerce, business, markets, technology, and geopolitics, and so that's why I picked them. I'm going to talk about oil market dynamics. We are in a low oil price environment. I know John Alterman mentioned this. What does that mean? Where's it going to go? Why is it happening? How should we think about some of those challenges? The second is the evolution of the natural gas market. Natural gas is one of those fuels that's been a niche fuel for a very long time. It's either too expensive, too cheap, not worth transporting, not worth moving, and a lot of that is changing. And I'm going to talk about how and why that matters, both in a global energy landscape perspective, but also in terms of the countries that produce energy or would like to consume more gas, and what it means for them. And then finally, I'm going to talk about climate change, both the challenge and the opportunity. Typically, when people want to talk about climate change, they talk to me about it being a really divisive issue. I don't think it has to be, actually. I think a lot of the divisiveness comes in how we talk about it, and not addressing people's concerns about how climate change is going to be addressed or could be addressed going forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. But first, I just want to orient everybody. So rather than do a large presentation about all of the different fuels and where they're used and who uses what and how much they use and put you all to sleep, I'm just going to propose that we've entered a new energy paradigm. The last several decades have been about scarcity. They've been about insatiable demand for energy, mostly coming from China, Year over year, 10% GDP economic growth comes with a pretty high energy cost, especially when that growth is energy intensive. And that has really been one of the most defining characteristics of the energy markets and the global energy landscape since about the mid-1990s. The idea that the world was surprised by the strength and the veracity of Chinese economic growth and behind the curve in terms of producing the amounts of energy needed to satisfy that growth. It came with enormous cost inflation. It came with enormous materials inflation. It came with a huge strategic focus on whether or not we were running out of energy. Was there enough energy? And I'd say this was across the board. China consumes fully 50% of all coal consumed in the entire world. And at the peak of their production, or excuse me, their growth, there were real and legitimate concerns about whether or not they'd even be able to get enough and the right quality coal to the demand centers that needed it within China. There were real questions about oil. I'm going to talk about peak oil today, but not the kind that you remember from the 1990s. Not the kind where we're worried about the supply of oil, but the part where we're worried about the demand for oil. Is there going to be enough demand for oil going forward? Well, in the 1990s, that wasn't the question. The question was there enough resource underground that was accessible and affordable to be able to fuel this rapid economic growth? And on a geopolitical level, would the demand for resources, the competition over resources, lead the US and China and other major emerging economies to fight over those resources? I still remember when the Chinese national energy companies went out abroad in their first going out strategy, which was to go and find energy resources outside of China and start to invest in their development. And I worked in the US government at the time, and there were some people who were terrified by that. They said, here we've been for the last 30 years trying to create open and free markets for energy resources and trade, particularly oil, to make sure that the kind of security environment we found ourselves in the 1970s, where there was an embargo and we weren't sure where the resources were going to be coming from, would never happen again. And now we've got this big new competitor on the market that is investing in energy resources. Are they going to put the Chinese stamp on a barrel of oil and bring it back to China? Or is it going to contribute more to the global energy market? These were real and active questions during that period of time, and it was a huge area of preoccupation for policymakers, both here and those in China, who were thinking on the other side of that equation, how do we simply ensure that we're going to be able to get enough resources here and do it in a secure way? Today, we see slowing Chinese demand for energy. It's not declining, but it's much slower than it has been. And what's been one of the most fascinating parts of my work is to watch people think about not only the fact that China is consuming less energy, but they're also very actively trying, not less energy, excuse me, consuming energy more slowly, but they're also actively trying to reshape their economy to be less energy intensive and to drive new and different types of energy into their consumption mix. We still tend to think about China and energy consumption and the global energy patterns as being on that unsatiable path. The idea that we are going to need to race to keep up to energy demand growth, when in fact the market has changed. We find more and more places, the US quite fundamentally being one of them, where we actually have an abundance of resources. We are long energy supply in a lot of different ways. Now, that doesn't mean different regions don't go through scarcity or don't have difficulty finding and accessing resources, but it does mean that the mentality of having enough versus scarcity versus abundance is really shifted. We no longer have an OECD-driven energy economy. What do I mean by that? The developed world is no longer driving energy demand going forward. In fact, if you just look at oil demand going forward, the vast majority, indeed all energy demand in that sector is coming from non-OECD economies. and developed economies' consumption is expected to decline. That happened over the period of the last decade, and it's a really interesting point because I think usually when you think about energy and geopolitics, you think the people who have energy have leverage over the energy system, right? They're selling it. They have something that others want. I think in this context, we recognize that consumers have leverage, right? Every energy company in the world wants a foothold in India, wants a foothold in Southeast Asian markets, in African markets. We're thinking about how to court these new energy consumers and how to make sure that you can access and quite frankly, from a public policy perspective, influence the way that they develop going forward. I talked already about the scarcity and security mindset versus the abundance across all energy sources. I'll talk a lot about this within the context of the oil and gas trends that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. But a huge portion of this abundance is coming from the United States. The unconventional oil and gas resources that we found that were producible because of a combination of technology, high prices, and the commercial and industrial complex, plus the investment that we have here in the United States, basically allowed for the largest surge in oil and gas production in the history of the oil and gas sector, right here in the United States, just over the last decade. And it's been remarkable to watch, and it's really changed the way that people think about extractive resources. At the same time, again, I'll talk about it a little bit later, the cost for things like solar and wind and batteries are coming down at really startling levels. And that has caused people all over the world, whether you're in a remote village in Rajasthan, India, or if you're in a rural community in the United States, or an urban setting in the United States, you can access renewable energy resources now at a cost that you just couldn't before. And I think that that has added to this sense that there is a lot of energy and there's a lot of options out there, particularly for you as a consumer. I think that the lesson of the last several decades, between 1990 and 2010, was bigger was better. You wanted scale. As a company, there was a lot of mergers. You wanted to have access to more markets, diversity in the markets that you were in. You needed to be able to scale solutions, larger facilities, floating liquefied natural gas facilities, the large complexes, big investments. It was all about scale. And I think that's really flipped on its head. Right now, particularly in an atmosphere of lower economic growth, and uncertainty about the trajectory of that growth, about environmental policies, about a whole host of issues. Being nimble, being agile, whether you're in the oil and gas sector or the electric power sector, is actually an advantage these days. You're a disruptor. You can move more to where the opportunities are. It is certainly the lesson of the US tight oil and shale gas opportunity, and it is increasingly the lesson of people who are putting household, whether it's storage units or solar photovoltaic units, into local communities. So this idea that business has disaggregated, that energy can be distributed, is really disrupting, both in positive and negative ways, the energy systems and, quite frankly, the energy policies that we all spend a lot of time thinking about. And then finally, climate change. Climate change between 1990 and 2010 was really a top-down effort. This was the era of the Kyoto Protocol, an agreement where all the major developed economies in the world got together and decided they would divvy up the amount of emissions that they would reduce in an effort to deal with global climate change and proceed from there. It didn't work so well. It had some successes, but it didn't ultimately get everyone to where we need to be in terms of reducing emissions. Between 2010 and the present, it's been more about bottom-up, and I'll talk about this in the last presentation. And I think we're increasingly going into this bottom-up world, where yes, of course, national level policies are really important, and global cooperation is really important. But increasingly, we're looking to subnational entities, local communities, you as individuals, small companies, small efforts distributed around the world to aggregate up to a bigger and better solution in terms of what we're going to do about the global climate change challenge. So this is how I see the world having really shifted in what is a very short period of time. It's also happening where we have a very robust and dynamic geopolitical landscape. These are not my ideas. These are ideas of the late Dr. Brzezinski. Dr. Brzezinski was a trustee at CSIS, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and he wrote a book. And the book was about the global realignment, both above and below the surface. What does this mean? It means he thought we were going through a pretty unprecedented time. Much like the energy sector, it's happening at two levels. You've got the geopolitical challenges going on at the different countries, whether it's the US or Russia or China, Europe, and then that's the flag of Syria. It's meant to sort of talk a little bit about what the entire Middle East region is going through, which I know my colleague John Alterman talked to you about yesterday. And each of these big power players is navigating their role in the global geopolitical landscape, trying to figure out what's its place, how does it steer itself vis-a-vis a rising China or Russia that is more active, to use a neutral term, on the global stage, a Middle East where we can't find due north, really hard time figuring out how order reestablishes itself in some way, shape, or form in that region, and Europe trying to figure out what to do with its declining power status. Not to say that it isn't an important player, but wondering how you continue to be influential in a system, in a world where norms and institutions that you had a role in setting up are increasingly being challenged. But it's all happening also at a period of time where there's a mass democratization of information. And this is what Dr. Brzezinski called the Great Global Awakening. The idea that individuals around the world know more about the world around them and have opinions they're developing about their own governments and those global systems. What does this have to do with energy? You're all asking yourself. A lot. Energy is power. Energy is power at a local level. Energy can be power at a global level. And when power dynamics within a country and in between countries are changing, energy can play a role. I don't advocate that it does play a role, that's my personal opinion, but it does tend to. So when we end up finding ourselves in a very fluid geopolitical environment, it routinely has an impact on where companies invest, how countries treat their energy resources, things like that. The last thing I'll say on geopolitics that is sort of an overarching comment on how we're thinking about the changing energy landscape is the world isn't just divided into nation states inside their borders, outside their borders. This is not just a Westphalian experiment. There are transnational trends that are affecting a lot of the ability of different governments to actually do their job, to make and plan, to have energy policy, enact energy policy, conduct trade with other countries. And so I just put a few of them up there that we commonly hear about. I'll go into an energy company's offices, or I'll go and talk with a senator, a congressman, or a group of people who are, in Washington from another country, and we start a conversation that's about energy. But we find ourselves then talking about one of these things, right? The idea that there's a backlash to globalization, there's a concern about an interconnected world, that more countries are experiencing isolationism, there's a populist trend. We spent a good 6 months this year actually studying the intersection between populism and energy, and it was really quite fascinating. That there needs to be some curbs on capitalism within financial markets, that financial markets need to reflect environmental values, all kinds of different interesting transnational trends. What makes it really difficult is to analyze all of this. And so what we find is that people bring to these conversations their own preconceived notions about why they think these transnational trends are happening and what effect they might ultimately have. And it can be one of a few different things, right? We're heading in a world where this is just realism, that we were in this period of time where we were, having a lot more interconnection in the world. It was a liberal order, but that couldn't last because that's not the basic nature of nation states, right? So this is realism revisited, and that's where we're going to be, and this is the period of time we're living in. And then the second is there's actually resilience to that liberal international order, and then this is a setback, but that after setbacks come progress. And so we just find ourselves in a period of time where maybe there was too much change too fast. And we're kind of pushing back from it, but again, the system will sort of refresh itself. And then finally, it could just be opportunistic chaos. People who are in the international affairs world that think that we make too much of these global order questions, this just could be a time where you go and get yours, or somebody else will. I don't know. I really don't know the answer to these questions, but I do think that it's in the background in a lot of these energy conversations. I always, when I'm sitting and talking with people, try and figure out how they're thinking about the state of the world and global order when they're talking about energy and geopolitics, because it really helps me understand how they think different countries are going to act in that landscape and what they think possible policy prescriptions or good strategic insights might be for moving forward. How do we make sense of all this when you apply it to energy? And this does not, I don't want you to worry about all of the details on this, but typically what we find is that policymakers are thinking about three different things. They're thinking about economic objectives, they're thinking about environmental objectives, and they're thinking about security and foreign policy objectives. Now, a fun thing to do is to take this triangle and apply it to different countries. Because different countries will think, most countries think energy efficiency is kind of the sweet spot. If you use what you have more efficiently, it satisfies all of those objectives that you're trying to balance. But everything else has trade-offs, right? So you can use more coal because you have it domestically, but maybe there will be environmental concerns about that. You can use more renewables because it solves your environmental issues, but maybe it's going to be more expensive. Everybody tends to use oil, because quite frankly, it's thermodynamically quite efficient. It's a great fuel. But it always has security concerns because it's a global commodity. So even if you have enough today, if the market is generally scarce or there's competition for that resource out there, you can have security concerns related to it. So whenever we think about energy policy, we think about people who are trying to balance these three objectives and recognizing that most of the time they're going to have trade-offs. And a lot of times they're going to have unintended consequences. But this is the real challenge that we find policymakers trying to grapple with. Okay, so let's get into some of the substance. First, I want to talk about oil market dynamics. And when I say lower for longer prices, I'm reflecting to you a key industry term that's been around for the last couple of years, which reflects the idea that in 2014, when oil prices went from well over $100 down to around $30 in a very short period of time, folks were singularly focused on how long oil prices would remain low and what the terms of the recovery would be. Was this just a one-off? Was this the market reacting to the fact that the Saudis had decided not to defend price and cut their own production? Were we going to see kind of a V-shaped recovery where all of a sudden oil prices rebounded? Was it going to be more of a U, right, where we stayed at a low price for a period of time and then came back? Or are we in a new period of volatility, where essentially oil prices are going to go up and down and up and down and up and down? And quite frankly, unless any of you have large investments in oil, who cares? Why is that a big deal? Well, oil is a pretty important commodity. What happens with oil prices does feed through the economy in a pretty profound way, and even in a more profound way here in the US. How many of you have seen this Economist cover? Great. So you know this idea out there. The idea here is that we're in a global competition, the sheiks versus the shales, the big Middle Eastern oil producers and the small, relatively, independent oil producers in the United States that essentially, over a period of 5 years, added approximately 4 million barrels a day of oil to the market. That's Iraq. Nobody saw it coming. When it first started, people would ask us, what is this? It started with gas, by the way. I'll talk about gas next. People said, what is this hydraulic fracturing? What is this shale gas resource? Is it profitable? Is it sustainable? People are sort of still asking those questions now, but what they do realize is that 95% of the production increase in oil and gas coming from the United States has come from 7 basins. And increasingly, those basins are contributing more and more oil to the global energy supply. The US is currently at 9.3 million barrels a day of oil production. That's pretty large. Now, we have an oil market that's approximately 90 million barrels, so it's, it's not everything, but it is a significant surge in oil production. And so people looked at what happened in 2014 and said, the OPEC countries are basically trying to starve the US industry. They're trying to put it out of business, and so this is a competition. I actually didn't think that. And the only reason I didn't think that, and my colleagues and I didn't think that, is we knew that the Saudis, in particular, one of the members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries that actually has some spare capacity, produces about 10 million barrels a day, thought that they couldn't actually change the market. They looked at US tight oil production. I'll call it tight oil production, or I'll call it short cycle production. When I call it short cycle production, I do it because one of the interesting features of it is that it can happen quite quickly. If you were to develop oil and gas, deep water, offshore, the Gulf of Mexico or in Brazil, it'd take about 10 years to get a project up and running from start to finish. In the oil patches of Texas and North Dakota, it's not nearly that long. You're looking at a 6 to 9 to 1.5 year window, depending again on what stage of development you were in when you acquired it. So it's this new resource, and I think the Saudis looked at that and said, we need to understand this better. We think there's been a structural shift in the energy markets, and we have to understand it. So, and again, I know you can't read all of this, but it's actually a really important scorecard for me. I think we've been conducting an oil market experiment, and I'm going to go through each of these issues quite quickly. The last 2 years have been about not only OPEC and non-OPEC countries that have joined them recently in a decision to actually cut production in order to try and boost prices a little bit, to understand how substantially the oil market has changed and what their leverage over that might be. And so for the past 2 years, we've been tracking 5 distinct factors. The first is oil supply elasticity. To go from over $100 a barrel to less than 50 for a sustained period of time is a pretty dramatic change. And if markets are working and there's enough demand for oil, you should see a fairly significant uptick. Excuse me, I skipped to demand elasticity. We'll do 2 first, and then we'll go back to 1. You should see a fairly significant uptick in demand for oil. Well, we did. We saw a fairly significant uptick in the demand for oil, particularly in transportation fuels in the United States. Not as much in Japan and Europe, and certainly in China, India, and some other developing economies. But it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't super robust. And quite frankly, the longer the low oil price environment has been around, we've seen some limits to this. But by and large, oil producers look at demand elasticity in the market and say, okay, if prices go down, demand still goes up. There's still some resilience out there in the market for this fuel. I'll get to why that's important in a little bit. Oil supply elasticity. This is the big ticket one. This is the one where OPEC countries in particular wanted to know what on earth happens to US tight oil production when prices decline. Do they all go out of business? We know they're cash strapped. We know they're indebted. Do they go out of business? A lot of them did. But production really didn't decline that much. It certainly did in 2016. The US came off several 100,000 barrels a day in production. But as prices have increased going into 2017, we've made that up and then some. So we've shown that the US tight oil sector can experience periods where production declines, but as the chief economist from BP, the oil and gas company, recently said in their oil outlook, US tight oil is sort of like a Weeble. You guys know what a weeble is?
So I do know that some folks are still gathering, but I would like to give Sarah as much time as possible here to continue her lecture. So why don't we go ahead and continue with Sarah Ladislaw.
Okay, well, thanks for those of you who came back. Working in the energy industry, when there is a siren or an alarm, getting out of the building is absolutely the right thing to do. So congratulations for making the right choice. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly because I think it would be good to have time for Q&A and discussion. Where I left off was the other factors that are out there in the oil market where I think OPEC and quite frankly the United States as well are really curious, is what kind of power and coherence does OPEC actually have? Now, there's lots of people who have different opinions about whether they were ever able to control oil prices in the first place. But the question is, can they do it now? Well, for the first year or so of this oil price downturn, OPEC decided to sit it out. They said, nope, we're going to let market forces, which just means cheap oil, determine who the winners and losers are. That got really hard for them to do. Most OPEC producers have a break-even oil price for their domestic economy of well over $50. Some are well over $150. They need this revenue to be able to make their economies work. They can't sit it out forever. So basically what they decided was to have a coordinated production cut. They decided not only OPEC, but also countries like Russia and several other countries would look to cutting supplies in order to bolster prices. We're still in the middle of that experiment. They cut for a 6-month period of time, saw a good, about $10 increment in the price of oil. So we went from about 40 to 50, 45 to 55, which is great. That's a really big boost for their economies. But over a period of time, it declined, because in addition, when those oil prices increased, what happened is US tight oil production increased. So that weeble that I was talking about before I set off an alarm, let's hope it's not weebles, people learned that a weeble is a toy. You push it over and it comes back up again. US tight oil. You push it over, but it comes back really fast, really aggressively. And what we also learned is that those darn innovative US oil and gas producers didn't sit on their laurels when prices were low. They learned. They became vastly more efficient. Now, some of that was because materials costs came down, but they were able to produce more and more quickly. OPEC has had to extend their cuts. They've had to extend them for another 6 months. And now they're talking about including countries that were previously not included in the production cut, like Venezuela and Nigeria and Libya, because those countries were considered to be well below their production quotas and also suffering internally in terms of domestic conflict, civil strife, those sorts of things. So now, excuse me, not Venezuela, Venezuela is not part of that. So now they're thinking about whether or not they should include Nigeria and Libya in the cuts. And just yesterday, this fourth issue of OPEC cohesion started to peek its head around the corner. How long can OPEC hold up these production cuts? It hurts all of them. To the extent that they are really cutting and not just sort of playing games with numbers, it hurts. How long can they do it? Well, Ecuador basically said, we can't do it anymore. They're a small oil producer, not a huge, meaningful one within OPEC. But this question about cheating, whether their coherence, whether their strategy to try and control prices is a big deal. Because if OPEC gives up, the market will read that response and prices could potentially go even further down. So what they're doing is trying to hold these cuts until markets and oil prices can recover. Those are all the short-term issues, but they're existential short-term issues for a lot of countries that depend on oil wealth. It's also really important to note that there are longer-term issues, and one of them is climate change. There's a fundamental question out there about whether all kinds of policies, whether efficiency policies, other sorts of things, have really meant that going forward, there's not going to be as much demand for oil. Now, I know that seems a little passé right now, particularly because the United States is not talking very aggressively about doing something about climate change, and our leadership on the issue is really fundamental to the global climate movement. However, it is a really big deal towards the end of the last administration and around the time of the Global Paris Accord, where folks were saying, are we going to see an end to oil? Has oil demand peaked? And if so, that demand side of the supply-demand ledger, it could be a problem for oil prices going forward. Each and every single oil company has a view on this now. Every single national oil company has a view on this now. And it was particularly important because a country like Saudi Arabia launched a program that I know John Alterman talked about yesterday called Saudi Vision 2030, where they basically decided we're going to lessen our economic reliance on oil, not because we think it's going to go away, but we're less certain about its role in the global economy going forward, and we need to diversify our options. They have huge, ambitious plans in this regard. Most of them they probably won't reach, but they're trying, and they're trying earnestly. And that's a fundamental shift for global oil markets. This is just an outlook. This is the oil market game, but since we lost a little time, I'm going to skip over this. If you have questions over it, you can ask me about it. So, as I said in the beginning, will prices go up? Will prices go down? And who really cares? Prices could go up. What are the things that are causing positive supply pressure? We could have an oil supply disruption. One of the real dangers of this supply and abundance mentality that we find ourselves in is we forget that oil supply disruptions can happen and prices can increase quite quickly. You can have shortages. That's a distinct possibility. Particularly, people think a lot about places like Venezuela these days, a place from which we get 800,000 barrels a day of oil here in the United States. Cyclical underinvestment in upstream production. Guess what happens at $30 to $50 oil prices? People don't invest as much. They cut their costs. It's been happening for 2.5 years now. What's going to happen if oil demand comes back in a very big and robust way? Can this short cycle oil that I talked about, this magical resource we found in the United States, fulfill the kind of supply gap that we might have coming in the future? It's a very large and active question. Sanctions. The US Congress is actively considering additional sanctions relating to energy on Iran, Russia, and Venezuela. These types of things only further the interest in non-investing in the oil sector in those countries. And quite frankly, at least for two of them, they're places where there's abundant resources and a huge amount of production could come from going forward. And then finally, midstream infrastructure lags. That sounds like a funny term, doesn't it? Oil does nobody any good in the ground. It does nobody any good. Crude oil doesn't do anybody any good other than the people selling it. You have to get it places. And building that infrastructure to get oil and gas and other resources to the places where they're refined into products is something that has been quite difficult here in the United States and is difficult in other countries around the world. Those things, if that infrastructure doesn't get built, prices could also increase. And finally, as I said, prices going down, failure of this OPEC strategy, slower economic growth, the concept of peak demand, and new supply resources or discoveries. The US isn't the only country that has these resources. Other countries do as well. They have trouble producing them in the way that we do, but it's not implausible to think that someone will crack the code and do so. So I talked about why this matters for security, stability in the countries in the Middle East. It also increasingly matters here in the United States. After the 2008 economic crisis, one of the largest stimulus packages that we had here in the United States wasn't a government program at all. It was development of shale gas and tight oil resources. Had a larger stimulative effect on GDP and jobs in the US than the entire ARRA, which is the government stimulus package. It's a pretty big deal. Interestingly enough, what we found when prices declined, it has as much drag on the US economy as positive impact. Usually we think oil prices decline, you and people who spend money on energy resources have more money in their pockets. It has a stimulative effect. So many people will make money off of oil and gas and petrochemicals in the United States that basically the economic effect was a wash. The more we produce, the more we become like producers. Low prices will impact the US economy in a negative way. So it matters. All of this oil price fluctuation matters in new and different ways, ways that it didn't before. One of the things people always ask about, so I always include a slide on it, is about this peak oil demand and the question of electric vehicles. Will electric vehicles eat into oil demand? I think one of the things is there's a huge amount of private sector activity, public sector policies driving electric vehicles and electrified vehicles into the market. We've seen huge amounts of growth. I think the question and the challenge is always one of timing and capital stock turnover. It's going to take a long time to replace the engines that we have. And light-duty vehicle, quite frankly, demand for oil going forward isn't really the big growth increment. It's heavy-duty oil. Heavy-duty shipping, heavy-duty vehicles, marine transport, those sorts of things, that's where a huge amount of oil demand is coming from going forward. So while I can feel really, really positive about the transformative effects of electric vehicles and a whole bunch of other things that I've put up on this slide that are influencing energy demand, particularly for oil in the transportation sector, I also know that there's a bit of stickiness in the oil market in terms of where supply comes from. Let's go to gas and then climate change really quickly if I can. You're going to go over time? Okay, great. But I will move through it expeditiously. Natural gas, as I mentioned before, is always considered a niche fuel. Prices were either too high or prices were too low. In fact, if you're an oil and gas producer and you didn't have a ready-made market for gas, sometimes you wouldn't use it. You just flare it. There's a lot of gas flaring that goes on in the world. It's terrible for the environment, by the way. But it's because, as one of the affiliates in my program likes to say, oil is like dating, gas is like marriage. Oil markets can be very transactional. You can find a buyer, you can find a seller. You don't need long-term contracts necessarily. It all works out just fine, very transactional. Gas has traditionally been a business where you need the supply, you need the demand, you need a long-term contract and some physical infrastructure to bind you. That's been the gas market. What's changing in the gas market is that relationship. We now know that there's a huge amount of gas. This is the United States. If you look on the left-hand side of that dotted line, that was US gas production from 2000 to the present day, 2016. Look at that green wedge. 2/3 of all US gas production now comes from this stuff we call shale gas and tight oil plays. Both the gas you're trying to get out of the ground and the gas associated with the oil you're trying to get out of the ground. It is a really remarkable turn of events for the United States. We have so much gas that while the Department of Energy was studying whether we could export gas, they figured we could export vastly larger sums than anybody ever thought about. And one of the really interesting things about that is when I started my career at the Department of Energy, we were talking about how much gas we'd be importing. We were net natural gas importers. And people from Boston to the Gulf Coast were concerned about the security of bringing all this gas in through the ports on these crazy new vessels, excuse me, called liquefied natural gas ships. Now we're looking at questions of how much gas the US can be exporting. We already currently export a lot of gas to Mexico through pipeline, and we have a good inter-dependent trade with Canada. We are now, this is the Sabine Pass facility that Cheniere owns, the first LNG export facility in the United States. And there's well more that have been permitted for the US to be exporting gas going forward. This has changed a lot about the natural gas sector. One, it has shown people that we have a lot of gas. Gas in the United States today is about $3. Gas in Asia, depending on how you're buying it, ranges anywhere between $10 all the way up to $18. These markets are not like oil markets. They are not interconnected. But that is one of the things that's going to change going forward. this just shows the evolution of how much gas is traded by pipeline in 2000 and how much gas is expected to be traded by LNG out to 2040. Essentially what this means is you don't have to have that marriage. You don't have to have that long-term relationships, and these markets are becoming more liquid. So this is where demand is coming from. Demand is also changing. Traditionally, again, these bilateral relationships where one country sold gas to another were sort of the ways in which gas was bought and sold. In the LNG market, there were only a few countries, most of them, Japan, Korea, East Asian countries buying a lot of LNG on the market, huge portions of the market really coming through LNG through those countries. Going forward, it's going to come from these other countries, China, India, the Middle East, rest of the world. Other countries are trying to consume more gas. One of the problems, though, is that many of these countries have policies that advantage renewable energy. Sorry, problems for gas, if you're selling gas, not inherently a problem. If you're selling, a lot of these places have renewable energy standards that mean that the country is trying to put more renewable energy into the market. And a lot of these countries also have cheap and abundant coal resources. And so in many ways, we're finding that even though there's an abundance of gas and a willingness to purchase it, it's really hard for these countries that want to purchase more gas to put the policy and pricing incentives in there to actually get that gas to come to them. And that's a big challenge for folks that say, we've got all this gas, we just need to create a market for people to want to buy it. But this is what's been happening. You'll hear people talk about a natural gas glut, which essentially means we've got a lot of gas. And a lot of this came from, if you look at this slide, huge amounts of production and LNG export capacity in Qatar. Qatar was the largest gas producer in the world, largest LNG exporter in the world. And then a wave that came shortly after that of gas exports from Australia. And now the coming wave of gas exports from the United States. This huge capacity in LNG export is changing the way in which businesses and countries deal with each other. If now there's more of this stuff, as a purchaser, you have more leverage than the person wanting to sell it to you. So you can say, I'd like a better contract term. I'd like to be able to resell it to a third party. I'd like to be able to make this a more fungible commodity. What's interesting is that's starting to happen. The question is going to be how much of this capacity going forward is going to actually get consumed, and who's going to be able to have that market going forward. Other producers would really like to sell into this market. Huge gas finds in East Africa would like to make it into this market. The problem, Canada would really like to make it into this market. The problem is it's still expensive to build these things. We're talking $10 to $15 billion. They're very expensive, and you have to be sure the demand is on the other side. So countries that are looking to make a big bet on gas have to have a strategic reason for doing so or the economic underpinnings for doing so. The US has the economic underpinnings. At $3 gas, we're going to be able to make a market for what we're selling. Iran wants to sell gas. Iran is developing their gas capacity domestically, and they may want to participate in this market. Russia definitely wants to participate in this market. They have a lot of gas, low-cost gas supplier in the world. They'd like to do Arctic LNG projects, and they want to start bringing LNG through the Arctic to Asia. So there's a big geopolitical competition out there for who's going to sell gas to whom. One of the ways in which you typically hear about this in US policy is in the context of Europe. Right now, Europe is kind of like the swing market for excess gas capacity. If you can't sell it somewhere else, you might be able to get it into the European market. There's long been a concern that Russia uses geopolitical leverage because it sells so much gas to Europe, that it has sort of a captive buyer, and that Europe would like to find other alternatives for gas other than Russia. We hear a lot about this in the United States. For some reason, it's a big policy idea that people talk a lot about. And so one of the things that we've heard recently, I'm going to skip over this, from the US administration is that the US would like to be energy dominant, right? Because we have so much oil and gas, we'd like to be energy dominant. And one of the ways in which we'd like to do that is we want to sell more gas to Europe. And by selling gas to Europe, we can sort of break that hold that Russia has over Europe in terms of gas. It's a really interesting set of dynamics. Russia can basically beat US LNG prices into Europe any day that they want to. But it's a way in which this gas trade geopolitical dynamic is playing out in real time in terms of US policy and how we're thinking about our Eastern European, in particular, neighbors. I'm going to move on to climate change just because I'm conscious of time. Listen, climate change could be the entire scope of this conversation. It's something I've dedicated a lot of my working career to. This is how I think people tend to see climate change. You can either look at the dark side of the ledger, which is what are the impacts of climate change and all the doom and gloom scenarios out there, and you can look at the other side, which is what are the opportunities. And I tend to think we don't do that enough. I think that we should honestly be assessing the costs and opportunities of climate change in a more open and forthright way. What are some of the impacts? You know what they are. I think that one of the things that we've got to do is stop saying that the science of climate change is definitively settled and recognize that one of the 3 pillars of actively dealing with climate change in an effective way over the coming centuries, because quite frankly, that's how long we'll be dealing with this, is to dedicate ourselves to the science of climate change, is to really understand the ways at a much more granular level how climate change is affecting the communities around us, to understand where we have less certainty than other places. Uncertainty is not a bad word in the scientific endeavor. And I think it's really helpful as I watch my friends who sort of dedicate their lives to dealing with climate science. They understand that all of this is a really uncertain process, but that uncertainty shouldn't stop us from taking action. So one, how do we look at this in the work that I do? We see that the impacts of climate change are essentially a threat multiplier. The idea is that these types of changes, both the observed ones and the ones that we expect to see in the future, are ones that we really have to understand better, but our ability to deal with them might overwhelm our capacity as governments and society. So what do you do about that? You have 2 options, and you have to do both of them. Reduce emissions in order to try and stem the tide of global climate change, and adapt to the changes that are actually going to take place. That's climate change in a nutshell. Is that a good news story? Is it a bad news story? And what on earth is this Paris Agreement everybody is talking so much about? I will tell you, the road to Paris was long, and it certainly wasn't the end of the road. For those of you who've thought about climate change for a long period of time, we've been at this since 1992. That is the first time the global community said, we commit to doing something about global climate change. Everything else since then has been an iteration on that process, trying to figure out how you find a socially acceptable way to make a very large transition in the way that humans interact with their environment. And energy is often the leading spear of that. So what happened in Paris? Well, I said we transitioned to this bottom-up approach. We finally got almost every country in the world to the table to say we commit ourselves to this challenge. These are some of the tangible things that came out of it, and I won't go through all of it, but essentially it doesn't just include people saying, hey, we're going to reduce emissions. It says we're going to try our best to reduce emissions on our own terms. We're going to try and share what we've learned with each other, and we're going to try and do better every time we come back to this table. That's what was agreed to. It's a pretty malleable system. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that the United States has announced its intention to pull out. I'd like to just remind everybody that you can't just pull out. They have 4 years to actually enact that decision. And what I've found in dealing with the administration is a desire to actually have a back and forth on some of the merits of this issue. You can say it's disingenuous or genuine. People can disagree about that. But I have found that what is happening is there is an element in the US that doesn't want to be part of that agreement. They don't think it's fair. What I find in this agreement is that it's very malleable and you can put forward your best effort. So I think we are going to find an evolution within US energy policy over the course of the 4 years that finds much more nuance in the US position. I don't know whether it will be better or worse from a climate change perspective, but I do think we're going to see a period of change. So did the Paris Climate Accord solve everything? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And everybody who's party to the agreement would recognize that. The top line here basically shows the new policy, the contributions that the global community put forward in terms of reducing emissions. The bottom line shows what we would actually need to do. We're still a long way off from solving this problem. Now, there's some recommended solutions, technology wedges, on a cost basis for how to get there, but each and every one of these has economic, policy, and other things that make it hard for those actually to be delivered upon. So should we be really depressed about this? It's a very huge scale challenge. How should we think about the scale of that challenge? Well, on one hand, technology appears to be on our side. This is the cost decline rate that we've experienced for solar over the last several years. I'm going to skip through this and just get to it. This is the cost decline rate that we've seen for batteries. This is the increase in new investment in clean energy by region. One of the most positive parts of the climate change story is that many countries around the world now see clean energy technology as the next wave for competitiveness for their country. Whether it's China or Saudi Arabia or India or the United States, there are countries that are trying to win the day when it comes to unlocking some of these markets. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which is a company that actually tries to calculate all of this, is one of the companies that said there's a $4 trillion clean energy opportunity in China and India alone. It's a huge market. So where I find the most positivity on this issue is in people who want to sell the technology of the future. Yes, they're going to make small changes over a small period of over a short period of time, and it's going to be really hard to turn the tide of that global energy system to something that's fundamentally different in terms of emissions reductions. But back when I started this conversation, I said, this is a time for disruption. Right now in California, I can't remember what time it is in California, but about this time in California, they are now selling electricity at negative prices. They pay people to take electricity because they're generating so much solar. On one hand, this is really disruptive. Utilities are having a very hard time figuring out what to do about all of this. But they know they can't go back. They know that this is where the future is going. And so people and systems are adapting themselves to these new realities. And I think that we're going to find a lot of surprises going forward in what's actually possible. The one thing that I'll say is, there's also a jobs element of this new opportunity, and this is just a schematic that the Washington Post put together based on a Department of Energy study about the jobs in the US. A huge number of jobs in things like solar and bioenergy, wind, nuclear, hydroelectricity. There's 2.8 million jobs on top of this in the industries that get these resources places, so transmission lines, pipelines, those sorts of things. It's not to say one is better than the other, but I think if this picture looks fundamentally different than it would have several years ago. But I'd also say that this jobs issue, the question of whether solar jobs are better than fossil-based energy jobs, where those jobs are created, we're learning that the politics of these issues hits very deeply right at the local level. And we're going to have to manage that. And what I'd like to say is, we think this is tough. The countries that are acting really aggressively in terms of trying to reduce emissions, China, India, but also developing at the same time, have enormous state-owned enterprises in the fossil-based industries, coal, oil, gas, and they're going to have to figure out what to do with those people as well. So it's not just about investment and economic opportunity, it's about where jobs come from as well. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming back. I'm happy to take questions.
And folks, we're going to take a bit of time that we would have had for a brief meet and greet backstage to go ahead and do some Q&A, considering all of you having come back and how amazingly Sarah came right back and finished her talk. I very much appreciate it. As we're gathering some other questions, French President Macron reportedly a few days ago told a newspaper that Trump told me he would try to find a solution in the coming months, the possibility of coming back to the Paris Agreement, and also Macron making the point that about the link that exists between global warming and terrorism. Could you speak first to this point about Trump potentially coming back to the agreement and about this link between global warming and terrorism?
Sure. So, I think one of the things that is really interesting about the way the international community is dealing with the Trump administration's decision to pull out from the Paris Climate Accord is, one, to make it quite clear that they don't support the decision, right? So both in the G7 and the G20, there was an effort to isolate the United States and say, no, global leadership from the US is no longer the deciding factor on this issue. It happened both at those meetings, countries saying, no, we're going to rededicate ourselves to doing this, but also here in the United States. You've got 20-some-odd states and a lot of different cities led by Mike Bloomberg and Jerry Brown of California, basically saying, the federal government doesn't speak for what the US is going to do on climate change. We are still in this. So there has been a lot of effort to isolate the Trump administration and their position and decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord. Behind the scenes, though, world leaders have really looked at the Trump administration, and President Trump in particular, and decided he actually doesn't know what he thinks about this issue. But, so why don't we try and convince him? And to be honest, it could be a lot easier just to sort of shun and walk away, but I think President Macron is trying to say, you're a guy who likes a deal. I think this is a good deal. I think you care about terrorism. I think that the ways in which a changing climate is going to destabilize other countries around the world is going to only exacerbate all of these security threats that we have, including terrorism. And we in Europe find this migration crisis and all of these things that we're dealing with as real and present symbols of the way in which the climate is exacerbating existing threats in the global community. So I think that what he's trying to do is encourage the president to believe that doing something about climate change is a winning deal for the United States. We'll see if it works. Question from Twitter using the hashtag CHQ2017, by the way. What role will nuclear play in the world of energy going forward? Thank you so much for asking that. I cut out the nuclear portion because I talked too much, but it's a hugely important issue. 1/3 of all low-carbon electricity comes from nuclear power. China is building a lot of nuclear power. I think something like 26 reactors. They aspire to build more. But we are nowhere near on pace what would be required in terms of nuclear capacity if you think that it has to be part of a low-carbon energy future to what people say we're going to need. One of the things I find really interesting, and it applies right here in Chautauqua and in New York and the PJM region in the US, is, in fact, some of the policies we're putting in place in the US, plus low natural gas prices, are going to cause us to prematurely shut down nuclear facilities here in the United States because they can't make money. They can't compete with negative pricing. They can't compete with low natural gas. And so we're actually closing down nuclear power plants, which, to be honest with you, if you're Germany or you're France or you're Japan, right, where you've made a decision or you're in the process of making a decision about whether you want nuclear to be part of your mix, because there are nuclear waste issues that are deeply important to some people, that's fine if you want to make another solution, another plan for your energy economy. But here in the US, we are just not making some of those decisions. States are now choosing to subsidize nuclear energy to the tune of billions of dollars to keep these open. They will be a hugely important part of a low-carbon energy mix. But to say that the US has a national nuclear policy that is going to ensure that we deal with the waste issues, to put money into innovating to the next generation of nuclear technologies, and to figure out what to do with these existing units that we have that are shutting. This is something the Trump administration has said that they're going to focus on. It's something that the Obama administration said that they're going to focus on, and is actually probably an area where there can be some bipartisan leadership from this administration on that particular issue. I think the last thing I would say is there's a lot of concern about nuclear power being built by the Chinese. They're producing a lot of it, and there are some who are concerned about sort of the safety record and the security instances. But I'm not sure you're going to see a lot of nuclear power being built around the world absent two fundamental factors. One, a guaranteed rate of return on the cost of electricity, because nuclear plants go over budget and over cost pretty routinely. And second is financing. Who's going to finance the plants and take the risk? The Chinese are willing to do it, but as the United Kingdom has recently experienced, you make the political decision to take Chinese financing in a Chinese nuclear reactor design with a little bit of political peril.
Two more questions. Can developing countries establish enough of a renewable energy infrastructure to leapfrog fossil fuels in their progress?
I don't. It depends which ones. So I actually, Fatih Birol, who's the head of the International Energy Agency, they're doing a big study on African energy and development this year, and made an interesting comment, and I think he's right, which is Africa is probably the first country that could actually achieve at some significant margin this leapfrogging concept that people think about. I don't think it'll happen without fossil-based energy resources, but I do think that they're not locked into a pathway where it's inevitable. One of the things I find most interesting about places, particularly India, we're doing a lot of work in Indian states these days with our colleagues in the India program at CSIS, and one of the things I find really interesting is renewable energy is not only really instructive and helpful for them to do rural electrification or to be able to create new power generation sources, but because consumers have options, because you could get your own distributed renewable energy power, the utilities and the ones that have had trouble making the existing electric power, the centralized electric power system work, now feel like they have competition. They're listening harder. The government is trying harder to make those systems work. So in a way, just the competition for the customer has changed the way that the governments and the state level governments are thinking about developing energy in India as a result of that.
And our final question, you spoke about location of jobs for clean energy. What about the skill sets considered versus quote unquote dirty energy jobs?
Yeah, so I will say something probably a little controversial, but I actually don't think we know much about this topic. I think there is a lot of work that's done to prove that clean energy jobs or dirty energy jobs or fossil-based energy jobs or renewable jobs, what are better jobs, better paying jobs, and a lot of the studies are pretty skewed. One of the things I think is really interesting and worth spending time on is trying to develop workers that can be all of energy workers, right? So that you're not just trained to do one thing within the energy sector, you're trained to be able to work in multiple parts of the energy sector. There are local communities around the country that are trying to do this, to try and make energy vocation much more broad. So you're not a dirty energy worker or a clean energy worker. You're somebody who has a background that is a little bit more malleable to the idea that you would like to have some more job security, and so you'd like to work in different parts of the field over a period of time. People are thinking hard about what that curriculum actually looks like, and it's something that we're actually going to try and spend a little bit of time on, because we think maybe that could be, again, another way of creating a little less division among the energy communities within the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking
Thanks,
Sarah
everybody.
Ladislaw.
Thank you.